دومین سخنران ما خانم شکوفه سخی، دکترای حقوق سیاسی، زندانی سیاسی دهه 60 از 1982 تا 1990، یکی از شاهدین دادگاه ایران تریبونال، مدیر اجرایی سابق بنیاد دادگاه ایران از سال 2013 تا سال 2014. بفرمایید خانم سخی.
Thank you very much. My talk is about, it's in the context and in relation to the UN's special working group on truth, justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-recurrence. So I'll start by telling a little bit about myself. In the summer of 1982, I had just turned 18 years old when a group of Revolutionary Guards entered my parents' home to take me away, just for a few questions. 5 days earlier, they had raided my brother's home, just as he and his pregnant wife were sitting down for dinner. They were removed from the house without any trace for months after. 4 months earlier, the guard had plucked my then husband from the streets of Tehran, and I had just found him in Evin prison when they came for me. And it was also months that we were left in the dark, fearing for my other brother's fate, having no clue as to his whereabouts. And this is only to single out my immediate family. I leave aside my extended family, friends, schoolmates, neighbors, and so on and so forth. On the night they came for me, I left behind my 1-year-old son, 12-year-old sister, and my parents. For the next 8 years, I lived side by side with hundreds of women, young and old, from babies and schoolgirls to grandmothers. So I am here as a witness to the violence inflicted on the bodies and souls of many, to the levels of driving some to madness and others to turning against themselves and their cellmates. I'm also a witness, however, to the presence of resistance, of life, of hope, joy, and friendship in the midst of all the forces of death and destruction, even when our mates were taken away for execution. I'm a witness again to our parents' suffering, along with their imprisoned children, to their damaged life, unrecognized pain, their denied love and life. I am a witness to the unredeemable suffering of the siblings and the children of the disappeared, the imprisoned, and the executed men and women. But I am here also because I participated in a people's tribunal and gave testimony there. So once more, I come to bear witness to the resilience and resistance of a people who refuse the deliberate attempt to erase these events from the history of modern Iranians, to deny these horrific events and their legacies. And last but far from least, I am a witness to the significance of the force and power of others, the next generations, the international human rights activists, lawyers and judges, whose participation in the People's Tribunal is a vital, I would say, the indispensable acknowledgement and further development of this old and continuing resistance. Having participated in the Iran Tribunal, I found myself became an avid supporter of people's tribunals in general. First things first, then, the Iran Tribunal, like any other people's tribunal happening in the context of impunity, lacks the power to implement its judgment. Among the limitations of such a tribunal, I can point towards its incapacity to bring forth retributive justice, to bring the individual perpetrators to trial or to impose any measure of punishment. It can neither implement a restorative justice in the sense of forcing the state to adopt a policy of reparation or even to acknowledge itself as the perpetrator of crimes against humanity. And as in our case here, such tribunals do not have the power to get the attention of the UN's Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and the guarantee of non-recurrence, let alone to take it seriously. These are among the reasons people often add the term symbolic to such tribunals, and by so doing, limit the entirety of People's Tribunal to their legal meanings. To many, therefore, without the power of enforcement, the whole processes and events of People's Tribunal and truth commissions have little or no significance. They seem to resemble, as we say in Farsi, a lion without mane, tail, or guts. Such limited thinking continues. What can one expect from such a grassroots institution, a people institution, without the formal power of the state to back it up? There is, of course, a kernel of truth in this line of thought as far as it goes. However, on reflection, the significance and value of such a grassroots institution lies precisely in its distinction from those enfranchised by the power of the state. How can this be so? Why is the People Tribunal important if it cannot bring even a single perpetrator to justice? What is the value of its findings if even the UN and its Special Rapporteur fail to give it the attention it deserves? In response to such questions, allow me to refer to UN Rapporteur Mr. Pablo de Groot's mandate, which, among other things, insists on, I'm quoting him, applying a victim-centered approach in carrying out its tasks. Before questioning the practical meaning of a victim-centered approach, which I will get to it in a moment, we need to pay attention to the parameters within which Mr. de Groot is to carry out his tasks. He is to engage in regular dialogue and close coordination with, quoting, governments, international and regional organizations, national human rights institutions, and non-governmental organizations, as well as relevant United Nations bodies and mechanisms. Consider the possibility of pursuing truth, justice, and the guarantee of non-recurrence within national territories where the gross violation of human rights is an ongoing and continuous practice of state institutions themselves, of national governments and subsidiary institutions, such as in Iran, North Korea, Yemen, Syria, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka, to name a few, or think of Palestine. What does a victim-centered approach mean in practice, at least in the context of impunity, absent active dialogue with diasporic human rights institutions, absent the direct participation of victims and survivors who fled those countries? What is missing when the Special Rapporteur responds to and is principally in dialogue with the state's representatives, other UN delegations, NGOs, and research centers? A victim-centered approach requires responsivity and responsibility to the victims. When the mandate is not limited to post-transition and post-conflict countries, one wonders how the Special Rapporteur might succeed in holding accountable a state responsible for crimes against humanity, or even getting it to acknowledge its victims and the suffering it has inflicted on its citizens when it denies their very existence. Moreover, the process of assessment itself reinforces victimhood when voice and agency of those very people are not recognized or acknowledged by the UN Working Group tasked with assessing truth and seeking justice. When in the process of justice, victims are yet assigned the powerless position with no agency. Justice, in the end, requires the restitution of this agency itself. A fundamental significance of grassroots people's tribunal then lies precisely in its distance from those official parameters. A people's tribunal is capable of accomplishing and demonstrating that agency through the direct participation of the victims and survivors of crimes against humanity in the process of making justice happen. With the direct participation of victims, survivors, friends, families, and their supporters, a people's tribunal becomes the manifestation of their agency in practice. In direct opposition to the built-in denial of their voice and agencies within the formal and official national and international legal and political institutions, they erect their own institution, representing their agency and claiming their own voice. When, during the two stages of the Iran Tribunal in 2012, a mother, brother, daughter, sister, and father sat on a chair, one after another, addressing the truth commissioners, tried to jam into half an hour their stories of suffering and that of their loved ones. Each of them was a living representative of a people's resistance, resilience, courage, and vulnerability. In this sense, a people's tribunal goes far beyond anything reducible to the merely symbolic. It is the actual manifestation of their agency itself. It is their voice and their resistance. Here, to my mind, lies perhaps the central significance of the People's Tribunal. Yes, it does not bring the perpetrators to the dock, punish or send them to prison. However, a People's Tribunal renders the people, each individual, visible, allows each to have their own voice, and removes the imposed curtain of oblivion from the entirety of their existence. It is a venue in which the individuals announce their own recognition of their own suffering in the public space, and get the public to acknowledge them. Or, if their existence is still denied, the violators may be forced to acknowledge the willfulness of their ignorance, or at least forced to recognize that others do. And that happened to the Iranian government. It is true that People's Tribunal do not disempower the criminals, but it is nonetheless also true that they empower the victims, open paths for their will formation, shed light on the need for change in the way the official institutions treat their sufferings, urge and enable the individuals to engage their capabilities, and claim their right to be recognized as citizens of the world. Such tribunals transform the mandates of conscientious professionals, lawyers, experts, activists, and politicians. By no means do these aspects achieve the sought-for justice, but they provide an utterly necessary preliminary step towards that justice, especially in context of impunity, where there has been as yet no transition, where the criminals still retain power. Allow me to finish my talk by emphasizing that the Iranian experience of a state's systematic and systemic suppression of its citizens in its efforts to eliminate any dissent or independent voice and action is not a unique experience. It does not belong only to us. Every day, images and voices of people whose bodies, livelihood, and very existence are threatened and denied fill up our living space and time, pour out of monitors of our television sets, computers, phones, and newspapers. They are analyzed and calculated as casualties, victims, and a statistic to prove or disprove the propriety of different state policies, national, regional, and global, by one or another group of players. They are marched out in front of the public to justify actions or inactions of powerful parties or of those that seek access to such power. Where there is absence of grassroots peoples, institutions, politicians, political parties, where there is absence of grassroots people's institutions, politicians, political parties, ideologues, and religious leaders alike act as self-appointed representatives of victims of systematic and systemic violations of human rights, claiming to be the voice of the voiceless, a claim that in spite of all of its actual and potential virtues, perpetuates the voicelessness, namelessness of men and women whose bodies and lives bear the burden of injustice. And occasionally, they become coveted objects by different sides of power conflicts that claim these bodies in order to validate their own goals and strategies. And do not get me wrong, this state of affairs holds only when the suffering people are lucky. They are at least acknowledged as objects. Our human history has no shortage of tortured beings and denied lives that do not even get such consideration. Take the victims and survivors of Suharto political reign, where more than 1 million people were butchered, and the spirit of the rest of the population either pounded down on the power of fear or grotesquely twisted on the shadow of participating in the slaughter or by the guilt of their silence. And what about the thousands who were massacred in Syria between 1980 and 82? Or the faceless, nameless, abstract North Koreans who we only hear about when a powerful state deems their government a nuisance. The list is expandable almost beyond belief. Iranians also suffer from such violation, are among those on this list. The generation of Iranians who lived and died through the decade of the 1980s belong among the victims whose sufferings, names, and faces are useless and therefore irrelevant to the world's official legal and political institutions. Yet, on the other hand, their insistence on being counted as right holders individuals, as again the special rapporteur Mr. Pablo de Greiff properly defines victims of gross violation of human rights, is a persistent irritant to both the Iranian state's officials and its official oppositions as like. We hope to be more than a mere irritant as time goes on. It is in this context, I believe, that Iran's People Tribunal and its Truth Commission are actual examples of what Mr. de Greiff calls a victim-centered approach, an approach in which the victims directly participated in the process of creating justice. As again, what Mr. de Greiff says, persons, individuals, and holders of rights. And it is in pursuance of the very mandate to promote truth, justice, reparation, and guarantee of non-recurrence, and to fulfill the UN working groups' two immediate goals of providing recognition to victims and fostering truth, that I urge Mr. de Greiff and his team not only to enter into direct dialogue with the people's tribunals, but also to produce and to promulgate strategies to assist and forward people's direct engagement in the process of truth-telling and justice-making, especially in these contexts of impunity. I urge Mr. de Greiff to consider the findings and judgment of the Iran's tribunal and to relay the value of our achievements to other people in similar conditions. The findings and the judgment of the Iran tribunal are testimony to a collective resistance against condemnation to oblivion, to our persistence in recording our experiences, in sharing it as part of the experience of human community in general. It is testimony to our persistence in passing that experience on to the next generation and to our neighbors. It is our performing of our agency as people who are holders of rights, not as helpless victims seeking attention, but as citizens of the world, citizens whose subjectivity and agency have a claim to recognition and to protection of their rights and their lives by the world institutions.